The station floated in the quiet dark between star systems, far from any world that might claim it. It belonged to no one and everyone at the same time, which was exactly why the coalition had chosen it. Neutral ground, a place where generals and diplomats from a dozen different species could sit in the same room without the memory of old wars making it impossible to breathe. The Interstellar Coalition Assembly Station was not beautiful. It was wide and flat and gray, built for function rather than appearance, with long corridors that hummed with recycled air and pale light that never quite felt like sunlight. But it was clean and it was safe, and right now, in the year 2187, safe was the most valuable thing in the galaxy. The Keth War had ended 14 months ago. 5 years of fighting across the outer colonies had left scars on every species that had been pulled into it. Whole stations had been destroyed. Supply lines had collapsed. Species that had never met each other before the war had bled side by side in corridors and fields and the cold vacuum of space. The coalition had held, barely, and now its members were here to figure out what came next. Sergeant First Class Derek Holt was not here to figure out anything. He was here to stand at his post and look professional. He stood outside the main assembly hall in his plain gray service uniform, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward. He was not a tall man. He was not a particularly large man. He was lean and still and quiet, the kind of person a room forgets is there. His hair was cut short and dark, going gray at the temples. His face was calm in the way that faces get calm after they have had a long time to stop reacting to things. There was a scar along his jaw, not a dramatic one, just a thin, pale line that ran from below his left ear to the edge of his chin. Most people didn't notice it. The alien delegates moved past him in groups, their translators clicking softly, their robes and armor and body coverings as different from each other as their shapes. The Falori, tall and blue-white, walked in careful single file. The Gone clustered together the way they always did, their wide black eyes moving constantly. The Surath representative rolled past on its mobility platform and paid Derek no attention at all. Nobody paid Derek much attention. Humans were the newest members of the coalition. They were also among the smallest, the shortest-lived, and by every physical measure, among the most fragile. Most of the older species regarded humanity with a mixture of mild pity and genuine puzzlement. How had they survived the Keth War? The numbers didn't make sense. The tactical models didn't explain it. It was one of the questions the coalition's analysts were still arguing about in small rooms with too much coffee. Derek didn't think much about that. He thought about standing straight and breathing evenly, and not letting his left knee, which ached in the recycled air, show in his posture. He was good at not letting things show. He didn't notice the Duran general at first. That was unusual, because the Duran were very hard not to notice. General Varicol stood nearly 9 feet tall, broad and scaled in deep charcoal gray, with a flat angular head and eyes the color of old copper. He wore no ceremonial armor today, only the plain dark uniform of a Duran field commander, which somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. He had won 3 of them decisively, and the 4th only partially, which still bothered him more than he admitted. He had been walking toward the assembly hall with his aide, Sub-Commander Reith, when he stopped. Reith stopped too, confused. He looked around for whatever had caught the general's attention. He saw the corridor, the other delegates, the recycled light. He saw the human soldiers standing at the door. Varicol looked at Derek the way he looked at Terrain Max, carefully, systematically, reading what was there and also what wasn't. He saw the scar first, then the way the man stood, then the hands, then the eyes, which were light brown and very steady, and looking at exactly the middle distance, the way soldiers looked when they were paying attention to everything without appearing to focus on anything. He had reviewed the human military files before this summit, or tried to. Large sections were redacted. The casualty records made no logical sense. Units that should have broken had not broken. Positions that should have fallen had not fallen. There was something in the human military record that the coalition's analysts kept circling around without landing on. And it frustrated Varikal deeply, because he was a man who preferred to understand the things that could kill him. He walked toward Derek. Reith made a small sound of surprise and followed. Derek saw them coming and remained exactly as he was. His eyes moved to the general. He did not straighten further. He was already straight. He did not change his expression. It was already neutral. He simply waited, the way he had learned to wait, in places much less comfortable than a well-lit corridor. Varikal stopped in front of him. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at the human with those copper-colored eyes. "You are an escort soldier," he said. His translator rendered his voice as deep and flat and precise. "Yes, sir," Derek said. "You were in the war." It was not a question. Derek answered it anyway. "Yes, sir." Varikal's gaze moved to the scar along Derek's jaw. "That is old," he said. "Yes, sir." "How did you get it?" Derek thought for a moment. Not because he didn't know, he knew exactly, but because he was deciding how much of the answer was relevant. "Debris," he said, "from a collapsed ceiling. Cairo Station, second year of the war." Something shifted very slightly in Varikal's expression. Reith, standing behind him, went a little still. Cairo Station was not an unknown name, even to the Duran. Varikal looked at Derek for another long moment. His eyes moved across the man slowly, taking inventory. The jaw, the way the left leg carried its weight, the faint unevenness in the right shoulder, the hands, which had the kind of stillness that came not from ease, but from long practice at control. "You have many wounds," the general said. It was not an insult. It was an observation, clinical and direct. Derek looked at him. His expression did not change. His voice did not change. He answered the way he answered most things, simply, without drama, without pride. "Which ones?" The general said nothing. In 40 years of military command, across 4 wars, and more battlefields than he cared to number, Varikal had asked a great many soldiers about their wounds. He had always received answers, specific answers. A soldier pointed to a scar and named the engagement, and moved on. He had not expected a question in return. He had not expected those 2 quiet words to make the entire shape of his understanding shift, just slightly, the way the ground shifts before something large moves beneath it. He stood there in the pale corridor light, 9 feet of decorated general and 4 decades of war, and for the first time in a very long while, he did not have a ready answer. Reith looked at his general, then he looked at the human, then he looked back at his general. Derek waited, hands still clasped behind his back, left knee aching quietly, eyes steady and patient, and giving away nothing at all. Lieutenant Commander Amy Briggs had learned over many years of diplomatic work that when something unusual happened, the best thing to do was stay calm and ask questions later. So when Sub-Commander Reith came to her office the next morning and formally requested a private meeting between General Varikal and Sergeant Derek Holt, she did not let her surprise show on her face. She simply folded her hands on the desk, looked at the tall, 4-armed Doron officer standing in front of her, and said she would see what she could arrange. When Reith left, she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she went and found Derek. He was in the small rest area near the east corridor, drinking something hot from a plain metal cup and reading nothing, just sitting with the particular stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of rest. Amy sat down across from him and told him about the request. When she finished, he took a slow sip from his cup. "Why?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but Varikal doesn't do things without a reason. He's been reviewing human military files since before the summit started. I think you said something to him yesterday that he can't let go of." Derek looked at the table. He thought about those 2 words he had said in the corridor, not as a challenge, not as a performance, just as a genuine answer to a question that deserved a genuine answer. He hadn't expected them to land the way they apparently had. "All right," he said. Amy studied him for a moment. "You don't have to." "I know," he said, "but it's fine." She watched him a little longer, the way she sometimes did when she was trying to decide if he was telling the truth or just being easy to manage. With Derek, it was often both at the same time. She nodded and went to confirm the meeting. The officers' lounge was a quiet room near the upper deck of the station. It had wide windows that looked out into open space, a scattering of low chairs, and a table long enough to seat 8 people. At this hour it was empty, except for Derek, who arrived first, and General Varikal and Reith, who arrived exactly on time. The general moved differently in a small room. In the corridor, he had been imposing in the open way that large things are imposing. Here, folding himself into a chair that was slightly too small for his frame, he seemed more deliberate, more focused. He set both wide hands flat on the table and looked at Derek the way he had looked at him the day before, like a man reading a map he didn't fully understand yet. Reith sat to his right and said nothing. He had a flat expression that Derek recognized without difficulty. It was the expression of someone who thought this entire situation was unnecessary, but was too professional to say so out loud. Varikal began without ceremony. "I have studied the human military engagements from the Keth War," he said. "The coalition records, the field reports, what was not redacted." He paused on that word very briefly. "There are things in those records that my tactical models cannot explain. I am a man who does not like things he cannot explain. So I would like to ask you some questions, and I would like honest answers." "I'll do my best," Derek said. Varikal looked at him for a moment, as if checking whether that was a real commitment or a polite non-answer. Then he nodded. "Were you present at the Battle of Karo Station?" he asked. "Yes," Derek said. "From the beginning of the engagement to the end." "Yes." Varikal placed one hand on the table and spread his fingers slowly. 612 human soldiers, an industrial refinery corridor 3 kilometers long, 11,000 Keth assault troops attacking from 2 directions, no resupply for the duration of the engagement. He looked up. "The coalition's tactical model gave your unit 4 hours before operational collapse." Derek said nothing yet. He was listening. "You held for 19 days, Varikal said. 18 days and 14 hours, Derek said quietly, give or take. Reith's eyes moved to Derek. The correction was small, but the precision of it was not. "You counted," Varikal said. It was not a question either. "Yes," Derek said. He didn't explain why. Some things didn't need explaining to anyone who had ever been in a long fight. "You counted the hours the same way you breathed, because it was the one thing you could control, and control was the thing that kept you human when everything around you was trying to make you into something less." Varikal studied him. "How?" he said. The word was simple, but the weight behind it was not. He didn't mean how did they hold the corridor. Not exactly. The tactical part he could reconstruct. He meant the other thing. The part that didn't fit in any model. How do your people endure this? What is it inside a human being that does not break? The lounge was quiet. Outside the windows, space was its usual deep and indifferent black. Derek looked down at his hands on the table. They were still, the way they always were. He had never been asked it so directly before. Not by anyone, and especially not by someone with the experience to understand what they were asking. "Can I ask you something first?" he said. Varikal tilted his head slightly. "Go ahead." "Have you ever been afraid?" Derek said. "Not of dying, not of losing a battle. I mean afraid of stopping. Afraid of the moment when you just stop moving forward." The general was still for a long moment. The copper-colored eyes were unreadable. "I do not think I understand the distinction you are making," he said carefully. "I know," Derek said. That's why I asked. Reith shifted in his seat. He looked at the general, and then back at the human, and his flat expression had acquired something new in it. Not quite discomfort, but something close to it. The feeling of standing on ground that was not where you expected it to be. Varikal was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "Explain it to me." Derek leaned back slightly in his chair. He looked at the window for a moment, at the dark and the stars, and then back at the general. "I'll do better than that," he said. "I'll tell you about the people who were there with me. Not the battle. The people." He paused. "If you want to understand why we didn't break, that's where the answer is. Not in any tactic, not in any order that was given. In the people." Varikal said nothing. He waited. "There was a medic in my unit," Derek said. "Her name was Nina Coyle." He said it the way you say the name of someone who matters. Not like reading from a report. Like opening a door. And the general who had walked into this room expecting a debrief, and received something else entirely, leaned forward slightly in his too small chair, and listened. Derek did not start with the battle. He started with the morning before it. He told the general that Nina Coyle had been humming when the first Keth assault wave hit. Not singing, just humming. Some old tune that nobody in the unit could name, but everyone recognized, because she hummed it constantly. While she was checking supply crates, while she was eating, while she was wrapping someone's blistered feet after a long march. It was the kind of sound that becomes part of a place. So that later, long after everything is over, you hear a tune like it somewhere quiet, and your chest does something complicated. She was small. That was the first thing people noticed about Nina. Small and quick, and always slightly in motion. Like someone who had too many things to do, and not enough hours, and had simply decided to move faster rather than worry about it. She had joined the unit 8 months before Cairo Station, and within 2 weeks, everyone treated her like she had always been there. That was a gift she had. Making people feel like she belonged to them. When the ceiling came down in Corridor 7, on the 4th day of the siege, Nina was already moving before the dust settled. A support beam had collapsed across 2 soldiers. One of them was conscious and screaming. The other was very still and quiet, which was worse. Nina went to the still one first, because that was the right call, even though the screaming one was louder, and she worked without stopping for 11 minutes in a corridor that was still taking fire from a Keth position 40 meters away. The blast caught her when she stood up to move the second soldier back from the line. A concussive charge had gone off around the corner, and the pressure wave threw her sideways into the wall, hard enough to break 2 ribs and snap the bones in her left forearm clean through. She got up. Derek paused when he said that. He said it again, simply, without decoration. She got up. She looked at her arm, which was bent in a direction arms are not supposed to bend, and she said something short and sharp that Derek did not repeat in polite company. Then she found a piece of broken rifle stock in the debris, pressed it against her arm, and told the nearest soldier to hold it there while she used her other hand and her teeth to wrap it tight with a length of cord from her kit. Then she went back to work. She treated 9 more soldiers that afternoon. She made jokes the entire time. Bad jokes mostly. The kind of jokes that weren't very funny but made people laugh anyway, because laughing was something to do with your mouth that wasn't screaming. She said laughter kept patients from going into shock. She had read that somewhere once and decided it was true, and that was enough for her. Varikal had not moved. He was watching Derek the way the general watched things he was trying to fully understand, with his whole attention. Nothing held back, nothing filtered. "What happened to her?" he asked. His voice was careful, almost quiet for a Doron. Derek looked at him. "She made it home," he said. He said it like it was the only thing that mattered, because to him, it was. Reith made a small sound. It might have been nothing. It might have been the beginning of a question he decided not to ask. Derek moved on. He told them about Staff Sergeant Greg Okafor next. Greg was a large man, Not in the exaggerated way of someone who had spent too much time trying to be large, but in the simple, honest way of a person who had been built generously and then spent years doing hard physical work. He was from a small town in the Midwest, and he talked slowly and laughed easily, and was the kind of man who, when things got bad, became very calm. Not because he wasn't afraid. He was. He just had an arrangement with his fear. He acknowledged it, thanked it for the information, and then set it aside until later. On the 9th day of the siege, Greg was shot 4 times. Derek said it plainly. 4 times, in the same engagement, within about 6 minutes. The first shot took him in the left shoulder. The second caught him in the side. The third grazed his neck, which bled a great deal, but missed everything important. The fourth hit him in the upper thigh, and that was the one that should have put him down for good. It didn't. He kept moving. He pulled back 2 soldiers who were in the open and getting shot at. He held a position at a door for another 23 minutes, until the second squad arrived to reinforce. When he finally let someone look at him, he had lost enough blood that Nina, who was already running on a broken arm and no sleep, went very pale and stopped making jokes for almost an hour. When she asked him later why he hadn't gone down, Greg thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things, and then he said he hadn't been done yet. Reith leaned forward. His voice came out harder than he intended. "This is biology," he said. "Adrenaline, a high tolerance for pain. You are describing animals that do not process damage signals correctly. This is not extraordinary. This is just a different kind of machinery." Derek looked at him. He didn't look offended. He looked like a man who had heard this argument before and had a very simple answer to it. "How many of your soldiers re-enlisted," he said, "after an engagement like Cairo Station?" Then he closed it. Varikal was very still. Derek let the silence sit for a moment. Then he answered his own question, because they both already knew the shape of the answer, and he just wanted it in the room out loud. "Of the 61 of us who walked out of Cairo Station," he said, 44 re-enlisted within the year. Not because orders said to, because they chose to. He looked at Reith. Why would animals who don't process damage correctly choose to go back? Reith said nothing. The ones who came home, Derek said, remembered the ones who didn't, and they weren't ready to stop carrying that. The lounge was very quiet. Outside the windows, the stars were the same as always, cold and distant, and completely uninterested in the conversation happening in front of them. Varikal spoke slowly. "What does it feel like," he said, "to carry the dead?" He thought about it, the way he thought about most things that mattered. Honestly, without trying to make it sound better or worse than it was. "It doesn't feel like a weight," he said. "It feels like a reason." Varikal had no word in his language for what that meant. He knew that immediately. The way you know when a word you need does not exist, a sudden small empty space where something should be. Reith quietly pushed back his chair and stood up. He said something brief and formal about reviewing the evening schedule. He walked to the door and left without looking back. Neither Derek nor the general watched him go. They were both looking at the table, each of them thinking about people the other one had never met, in a place that neither of them ever fully left. The assembly hall was the largest room on the station. It had been built to hold delegates from 40 different species at the same time, and on most days it came close to that number. The seats were arranged in a wide circle, tiered upward like a bowl, so that everyone could see everyone else. Translators hummed at every station. The air was kept at a temperature that was uncomfortable for everyone equally, which the coalition considered a reasonable compromise. Derek sat in the back row of the human delegation section, which was a polite way of saying he stood along the wall behind the seats, because there weren't quite enough chairs. He didn't mind. Standing was easier. It kept him alert. Admiral Lena Cross sat 3 rows in front of him. She was a trim woman in her late 50s, with short silver hair, and the kind of posture that made every chair she sat in look like a command seat. She had spent 30 years in the human navy, And the last 4 of those years, fighting a war that nobody had asked for, and everybody had barely survived. She did not waste words. She did not waste time. And she had noticed 2 days ago that General Varicol of the Duran hegemony had taken an unusual interest in her escort sergeant, which meant she needed to understand exactly what was happening before it became something she had to manage. She hadn't asked Derek about it yet. She was waiting to see how it developed. That was her way. On the floor of the assembly hall, Delegate Phaeax was presenting the coalition's post-war analysis. Phaeax was a Surath, which meant it was tall and thin and pale, with long fingers and a voice that came out in precise flat tones that the translator rendered as calm, regardless of what it was actually saying. The Surath were the coalition's best record keepers. They had been collecting data on the Keth War for 4 years, and had organized it into a report that ran to several thousand pages. Fax was presenting the summary, which still took a long time. Derek listened with half his attention. The other half was watching the room, which was a habit he couldn't turn off, even in places where it wasn't necessary. The data was thorough. Fax moved through casualty numbers, resource losses, territorial shifts, and engagement outcomes with the steady efficiency of a machine built for exactly this purpose. Most of it Derek already knew. Some of it he had lived. Then Fax reached the anomaly section. The delegate's voice did not change. It announced the anomaly the same way it had announced everything else, with clean, flat calm. But the room shifted slightly. Translators clicked a little faster. The anomaly was this. By every measure the coalition had, human combat units should have become operationally ineffective within the first 2 years of sustained conflict. The model was based on solid data, biological limits, psychological thresholds, resource consumption rates, casualty replacement timelines. Every other species in the coalition operated within those limits. Some better, some worse, but all within a range that made sense. Human units had not operated within that range. Their effectiveness had not declined. It had increased. Not in the first year, when morale was still high, and the shock of war was new enough to push people forward. In the 3rd year, the 4th. In the grinding middle of a war that had no clear end and very high cost, human units had become more effective, not less. The models had no explanation for this. The analysts had offered several theories. None of them were satisfying. The hall buzzed quietly. Derek could hear fragments of conversation from the nearest delegations. Enhanced biology, secret augmentation programs, some kind of chemical or neurological modification. Nobody considered the simple answer, because the simple answer didn't look like an answer. It looked like a feeling. And the coalition on the whole did not put much weight on feelings. Across the hall, Derek found Varicol without looking for him, the way you find things you've been paying attention to without realizing it. The general was already looking at him. After a moment, Varicol gave a very small nod. Derek dipped his chin in return. Admiral Cross, who missed very little, saw the exchange. She filed it away. After the session, Amy found Derek in the corridor and told him the Admiral wanted to speak with him. Derek followed her to a secured debriefing room on the middeck, where Admiral Cross was already seated at a plain table, with her hands folded, and her expression doing the thing it did when she was being patient on purpose. Amy explained the situation quickly, the general's request for a formal debrief, the previous conversations, Varicol's questions about human endurance. The Admiral listened without interrupting. When Amy finished, Cross looked at Derek for a long moment. "What has he actually asked you?" she said. "He wants to know what the program is," Derek said. "The doctrine, the system behind why we didn't break." Cross was quiet for a moment. "What have you told him?" "The truth," Derek said. "That there isn't a program, that it came from the people themselves." Something moved through her expression. Not quite emotion, but the controlled shape of it. The way a person looks when they understand something deeply, and are deciding how much of that understanding to show. Then she nodded once, and said she would authorize the debrief. Varicol arrived 20 minutes later. Reith was not with him. The general sat down across from Derek, with the Admiral standing to one side, and Amy near the door. and he asked his question without any preparation. "What is the human military system for psychological endurance?" he said. "What is the program that produces soldiers who improve under sustained pressure, instead of degrading? I want to understand the mechanism." Derek was quiet for a second. Then he did something he almost never did during formal situations. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "There's no program, General," he said. "There's training. There's conditioning. All of that exists, and all of it helps. But the thing you're looking for, the reason the numbers went the wrong direction, that didn't come from any program." He reached over and pushed up the left sleeve of his uniform to the elbow. Along the inside of his forearm, in small clean letters, were 7 names tattooed in a single column. They were not decorative. They were not stylized. They were just names, written plainly, in the same simple way you would write a list of things you could not afford to forget. "These are soldiers from my unit," Derek said. "They didn't make it home." He pointed to the first name. He said who it was, a private from Ohio, 22 years old, who had been the worst card player in the unit, and the best shot. He described one thing about him that had nothing to do with the war. The way he laughed too loud at his own jokes. The way he kept a photograph of his dog in his helmet. He moved to the second name. Another specific, ordinary, irreplaceable detail. He went through all 7. By the time he reached the 7th name, the room was very quiet. Admiral Cross was standing with her arms folded and her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on a point on the wall, slightly above everyone's head. The way people stand when they are holding something carefully in place behind their expression. Veracals stared at the names on Derek's arm for a long time. "The Duran do not do this," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. To remember fallen soldiers in this way, it would be considered a distraction, a thing that pulls a soldier's attention backward when it should be forward. We process loss, and we move on. To carry it like this would be seen as a weakness. Derek looked at him steadily. "Do your soldiers fight harder after a loss?" he asked. "Or do they fight the same?" Veracal did not answer immediately. "Ours fight harder," Derek said. "Not because they're angry. Because every name on this arm is a reason not to waste what they gave." The general was still for a long moment. Then he looked up from the arm to Derek's face. "I would like to share the record of this conversation with the Duran High Command," he said. "With your permission." Derek looked at the admiral. Cross looked at Amy. A moment passed between them that carried a full conversation in no words at all. "Granted," the admiral said. Veracal nodded. He looked once more at the 7 names. Then he stood, straightened to his full height, and did something Derek had not expected. He brought his right fist to his chest, slowly, deliberately, in the Duran gesture of formal acknowledgement. The one given between soldiers of equal standing. Derek returned it without hesitation. He pressed his own fist to his chest and held it there for a moment. Neither of them said anything else. The last night of the summit was quieter than the rest. The treaties had been signed that afternoon. The formal sessions were over. The delegates moved through the station in smaller groups now, talking in the relaxed way people talk when the hard work is done, and what remains is just the human and not so human business of saying goodbye. The observation deck was the best place on the station. It was a wide curved room at the very top, with a ceiling made almost entirely of reinforced glass that looked straight out into open space. No ships nearby, no station lights pointing that direction, just the dark and the stars, endless and quiet and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the rooms below. Derek was standing at the far end of the deck, with a cup of cold coffee he wasn't really drinking, when General Veracal found him. He heard the general coming. Large beings were hard to move quietly, though Veracal tried, which Derek had noticed was something the general did. He moderated himself in small ways around humans, moving a little slower, speaking a little softer, as if he had decided at some point to stop letting his size do his talking for him. Derek thought that was interesting. It told him something about the kind of soldier Varikal actually was, underneath the rank and the reputation. The general came to stand beside him at the glass. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They just looked out at the stars together. Two soldiers from different worlds, standing in the same quiet. The summit went well, Varikal said finally. It did, Derek agreed. The treaties are imperfect, the general said. They always are, Derek said. That's how you know real people wrote them. Varikal made a low sound that might have been agreement. Then, he said, I reviewed the full classified record this week. The complete file on Cairo Station. The sections that were not available in the Coalition database. Derek kept his eyes on the stars. He didn't say anything. The real numbers, Varikal said. What your unit faced in the final 4 days. What the conditions were. What the casualty rate was in the last 48 hours before the relief force arrived. He paused. I have commanded soldiers for 40 years. I have studied war for longer than that. And I want you to know that what your unit did in that corridor is the single most remarkable thing I have encountered in my entire military career. Derek was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even and plain. There were better soldiers than me in that corridor, he said. I just happened to be one of the ones who walked out. That is exactly what I mean, Varikal said. The general was not looking at the stars anymore. He was looking at Derek with those copper-colored eyes that had a different quality now than they had 3 days ago in the corridor. They were still sharp, still reading everything. But something in them had shifted, the way a room shifts when someone opens a window. In 40 years, Varikal said, I have never encountered a species that fights the way humans fight. Not faster, not stronger, not with better weapons or better tactics, with something else. Something that makes the mathematics stop working. He turned back to the glass. My analysts have 17 theories. I have read all of them. None of them are correct. What do you think it is? Derek asked. The general considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. I think, he said slowly, that humans are the only species I have encountered who treat each other as irreplaceable. Every other species, including my own, we value our soldiers. We train them, we equip them, we mourn them when they fall. But there is always the understanding that the unit continues, that the mission is the thing that cannot be lost. The individual is important, but replaceable. He was quiet for a moment. Humans do not believe this, he said. Not really, not in the place where decisions are made under fire. You act as though every single person is the last of something. As though losing one person is a thing that cannot be undone or compensated for. And that belief, that stubborn, irrational belief, makes you fight in ways that should not be possible. Derek thought about that. He thought about Nina Coyle wrapping her own broken arm with a piece of rifle stock. He thought about Greg Okafor deciding he wasn't done yet with 4 bullets in him. He thought about the 7 names on his forearm and the 44 people who had gone back because they remembered who hadn't. It's not irrational, he said quietly. It's just true. Before Varikal could respond, there was a small sound at the entrance to the observation deck, and Derek turned to see Lieutenant Nina Coyle walking toward them. She had been promoted 6 months ago, and the ranks still looked slightly new on her, the way a good coat looks on someone who isn't used to wearing one. She was small and quick-moving, with bright eyes and a crooked smile that appeared on her face the same way sunlight appears, without warning and hard to look directly at. Her right arm hung just slightly differently than her left. If you didn't know to look for it, you wouldn't notice. Derek noticed because he always noticed, and because that arm was one of the reasons he was still standing. She had come as part of the human delegation's closing ceremony team, and had only arrived at the station that morning. She had found Derek through Amy, who had told her only that there was someone she should meet. Hey, she said to Derek, easy and warm, the way people greet each other when the word means more than it sounds like. Hey, he said back. Then she looked up at the very large alien general standing next to Derek, and did not blink. This was something Derek had always appreciated about Nina. Her complete inability to be intimidated by anything that wasn't actively killing her. And sometimes, not even then. "General Varikal," Derek said. "This is Lieutenant Nina Coyle. She was my unit's medic at Cairo Station." Varikal looked down at her. He straightened slightly, which was the Duran equivalent of standing at attention. He extended his hand in the human style, which he had clearly looked up, and Nina took it and shook it, without hesitation. "I have heard about you," the general said. "The broken arm." Nina grinned. "Everybody remembers the arm," she said. "Nobody ever asks about my other 18 broken things. Very unfair." Varikal looked at her arm, the slight difference in the way it hung. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. His voice was careful, genuinely careful, not polite careful. Nina tilted her head and thought about it with the same honest attention she gave everything. "Only when the weather changes," she said. "But I live on a space station, so honestly, not that often." There was a pause. And then General Varikal laughed. It was a short sound, low and rough, like stones shifting at the bottom of a riverbed. It was clearly not something his face or his throat did very often. But it was completely real. Nina looked pleased. Derek looked at the general with something warm and quiet in his expression, and said nothing. Across the deck, Reith stood near the entrance, where he had followed the general out of habit. He had heard the laugh. He was staring at Varikal with an expression Derek couldn't fully read. Something between surprise and recognition, like a man seeing a familiar place after a very long time away. 2 years later, on a small contested moon called Veth 4 in the Outer Rim, a Doron battalion was pinned down and running out of options. They had been cut off for 6 days. 3 directions of fire. The battalion's young commander, a Doron officer named Shurek, who had been briefed on human combat operations as part of his training, had sent the emergency signal and was now doing the math in his head, the same math that always came up short. Then the human rapid response unit came over the ridge. There were 40 of them. They moved fast and without hesitation, spreading into position along the ridgeline with a kind of quiet efficiency that looked almost relaxed until you realized what it actually was. The movement of people who had already decided what they were going to do and were just doing it now. No wasted motion, no visible fear, just purpose. And they were singing, not loudly, not in any way meant to intimidate or announce, just quietly, under their breath, a low and steady song that none of the Doron soldiers recognized, but all of them heard. The kind that sounds like it was written before anyone was keeping track of such things. It moved through the human unit the way breathing moves, without effort, without interruption, just present. Surek watched them take position. He watched them begin returning fire with a calm precision that started pushing the attacking forces back within the first 3 minutes. He watched the nearest human soldier, a young woman who could not have been more than 25, take a hit to her shoulder cover, check the damage, decide it was not serious, and keep shooting. He opened the comm channel to the human unit commander, a woman named Laura Finch, who had a voice like someone who had learned long ago that panic was a waste of good air. "How long can you hold?" Surek asked. There was a pause. 1 second, maybe less. "Longer than you need us to," Laura said. Surek closed the channel. Around him, one by one, the Doron soldiers who had been crouching for 6 days did the same thing. They straightened up, checked their weapons, and turned back toward the fight. The human song continued, low and steady under the sound of the guns. And on a station somewhere in neutral space, a Doron general sat in a quiet room with a report in front of him. A report from the front lines that he had already read 3 times, and pressed his right fist slowly to his chest. He stayed that way for a moment, alone in the room, the stars outside his window the same cold and distant and endlessly patient lights they had always been. Then he picked up his pen and began to write.